William Howard Taft did a lot of things that TR did not like, and as a result, TR reversed his blessings on Taft, and the Republicans were entirely split on what kind of candidate they wanted. So TR wanted to get back into politics because William Howard Taft was not doing what he wanted, so he ran as the progressive, and then the Republican Party was entirely split between three different ideologies, or I guess in this case two, which is the conservative side and the progressive side, but you also had a socialist run-in because America was more willing to embrace socialism at that time, and Eugene Debs won with 918,000 votes. Meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson was able to capitalize on the split of the Republican Party, which led to him winning a plurality of the votes, but a majority of the electoral votes. You can see here he won by 435. And he was campaigning on more soft politics and more on isolationism. But as we've gotten closer and closer to World War I, he started to change himself towards. He started to in World War I, I guess. Originally, America did not want to go into war, and Woodrow Wilson originally was not keen on going to war because it was against it was against his political instincts, but he did convince America to go into war eventually after German U-boats started sinking American ships. Woodrow Wilson started implementing propaganda, and that was embraced by the American public, which led to him being reelected towards his second term. And he was doing very well, but then he made a lot of mistakes after the war ended, where he started the League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the UN. But the thing is, by that time, a lot of Americans wanted to go back to isolationism because they saw a lot of Americans die during World War I. And that generation was called the Lost Generation because a lot of them, a lot of the people in that generation had to deal with war and the effects of it, the negative effects of it. And that persuaded voters in 1920 to go for Warren Harding. Warren Harding brought isolationist policies back by raising tariffs on imports from Europe across all industries. And then he also was known, just like Ulysses S. Grant, to be corrupt, to have corrupt cabinet members, and while he himself was not necessarily corrupt, he was too nice to let corrupt members be let off. But even with that, though, the economy was soaring after World War I, and Calvin Coolidge was the successor to Warren Harding because Warren Harding did die in 1923. Calvin Coolidge ran for election in 1924, and he was able to win because of that strong economy, and that led to Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was also benefiting from a strong economy under Republican presidencies, and he pretty much said, let's keep with the status quo, and so did Americans. Americans wanted to keep with the status quo, because if everything was going fine, then they did not really want change. But the thing is, even though the economy was growing, under the growth of the economy was a lot of errors that would lead to the Great Depression, and the Great Depression started under Herbert Hoover's term. While he himself might not have contributed to the main causes of the Great Depression, he did pass the Hawley-Smoot Act, or the Hawley-Smoot Tariff, which increased tariffs across all products, across all imports to 60%, which today is such a ridiculous number, but back then it was embraced by Congress. But that helped lead to the Great Depression, and as a result, FDR was able to capitalize on the anger that Americans had towards Herbert Hoover, and FDR won with 472 electoral votes. Again, you see all of these elections are all Republican presidents since 1916 because of Woodrow Wilson's because of Woodrow Wilson's failures, but FDR was able to win, and he started implementing the New Deal with a knockout list of policy proposals, policy successes within his first 100 days as president, and this kept on going through 1936, where he was elected again because the economy was starting to recover. But he made a kind of big mistake in his second term, which was that he wanted to go against the Supreme Court because the legislative and the executive branch was going in FDR's favor, but the judicial branch was still very Republican, especially the Supreme Court. So he wanted to pack the court by adding more members, up to 15 members in total, and that was one of the major mistakes he made, and that was how conservatives, Republicans, were able to start getting a grip on Washington again, because after 1932, Democrats really ruled the majority in the United States. They had a super majority in Congress, and they were able to get a lot of things done. But politics back then is not the same as today, because even though the Democratic Party was able to win, and FDR was in some ways a progressive, you see that FDR and TR, they're both progressives, but of different parties. Because back then the divide again was between big business and as well as the forgotten man. And in this case, the forgotten man won. But in the Republicans' case, in other presidential elections, the big business party won. It was really based on that divide alone and not much else. In terms of other divides, they were inside the party. So Democrats had divisions themselves, and Republicans had divisions themselves. But in terms of cross-party lines, the Democrats and Republicans really disagreed only on whether big business should be running or whether the government should be the big government. So that's the major divide. But in the 1940, back to the elections, the 1940 election saw FDR break precedent by running for a third term, and by this time World War II was starting to happen, and the United States did not want a change in presidencies because of World War II. They reasonably thought that if the current president was being a good commander-in-chief and a world war was happening, then why risk it to then go for another person? So they went for FDR, especially with Wendell Willkie not being a very experienced commander, so he was not able to win, and this kept on through 1944, where the war was about to end, but FDR ran again, and people still very well liked him, so he won by 432 electoral votes. But FDR died soon after in 1946, I believe. No, 1945 in April. And he was replaced by Harry Truman. Harry Truman was the vice presidential nominee in 1944, and Harry Truman was described as just average for everything. His height was average, his policies were average, everything about him was an average of the two sides. He came from Missouri, an average state, and known for the Missouri back then was known for the Missouri Compromise, and that was average. So everything about him was average, but he was small on small things, as one person said, and big on big things. And he was able to get a lot of things done in terms of international relations. He helped ensure the United Nations would actually work, unlike the League of Nations, which was unsuccessful. And then he also helped develop the atomic bomb, and he helped develop the atomic bomb, and he was part of the transition from World War II to the Cold War with his fight against communism. But in the 1952 election, we saw that Harry Truman would not run for another term, and instead Adlai Stevenson won. There's one more thing to talk about the 1948 election, actually. Harry Truman, in the 1948 election, was viewed as the underdog. He was viewed as the candidate who would not win because the Democratic Party was entirely split between staunch conservative Democrats, staunch progressive Democrats, and then the in-between Democrats. Harry Truman was able to win his primary pretty unexcitedly, but Thomas Dewey was able to win the Republican primary with a lot of cheers, and it was expected that Thomas Dewey would win, with Harry Truman and Strom Thurmond both being Democrats, but Strom Thurmond being an offspring from the Democratic Party as being a Dixiecrat. But the Chicago Tribune famously had a headline saying Thomas Dewey won the election. They called the election even before the results were final, before the results were actually coming out. But Harry Truman was able to get that come from the behind win and won with 303 electoral votes. But in 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower finally broke the Democratic tradition, the Democratic presidencies, and he was able to win. He was a former general. He helped command the United States in its Italian campaign and the Northern African campaign, and he was pretty successful until he met very strong resistance from Germany, but he was able to win this election. And he was most well known for the Federal Highways Act, which started building a lot of highways in the United States. A lot of them we still see today. And he was able to win the 1952 presidential election. And because of Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Republican parties were finally back in politics in terms of presidential politics, now that Democrats were not immune from losing. But John F. Kennedy was able to get elected into in the 1960 election, and this is where we start to see the Republican and Democratic flips, where we see a Democratic president for 2 terms and then a Republican president for 2 terms, and this would keep on going on and on and on throughout the rest of the presidential elections that we currently have. So John F. Kennedy was actually only able to win by a plurality of the vote, only won by 0.1%, and he won actually kind of narrowly, 303 electoral votes when 269 electoral votes was needed to win. But Richard Nixon was the Republican candidate, and he was not able to win primarily because of the flip between Republicans and Democrats, because America wanted constant change to occur. But John F. Kennedy died to a lot of American surprise, and Lyndon B. Johnson became president as he was vice president at John F. Kennedy's presidency, and he won his election with a landslide against Barry Goldwater, with a lot of people viewing Barry Goldwater as too conservative. Meanwhile, LBJ championed a lot of social causes for racial equity with the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and other measures, including the Voting Rights Act, which until Shelby County v. Holder was one of the milestones of LBJ's presidency. You can see here that the only states that went for Republicans are in the South. Those who did not want desegregation, those who did not want to change to a more racially equitable nation. Now, in the 1968 election, this was the election where Democrats were split. The Democratic primary, notably, was a very contentious process because until the 1968 elections, the Democrats and the Republicans actually nominated their candidates without the consent of the majority of the people in their party. It was mainly just delegates who would vote on a presidential candidate. Back in those times, voters of the Democratic Party would not actually vote in a primary system. But after 1968, that changed because the Democratic Party people started to revolt. The Democratic operatives and I guess the Democratic office holders, and that changed the system to what we see today, which is a primary system. You can see here that Richard Nixon was able to win in both elections, but after the 1972 elections, he had to resign because of Watergate, the only president who has ever had to resign, and he was replaced by Gerald Ford, who was vice president at the time. And Gerald Ford, originally he was popular, but then he pardoned Nixon preemptively, I believe, and that signaled his downfall. Jimmy Carter was able to win by bringing nice politics, libertarian politics into the system, but after Jimmy Carter won his election, there was a high inflation. Inflation started, the U.S. currency started to rise, crime started to rise, oil prices started to rise, everything started to rise, and a lot of people did not blame Jimmy Carter for a lot of the inflation problems, and Ronald Reagan was able to win in a landslide. He, contrary to what a lot of people think today, Ronald Reagan was actually, in some ways, a progressive. And the main way he was a progressive is similar to the way that FDR was a progressive, which was that Ronald Reagan appealed to the common man, to the forgotten man, as stated in FDR's presidential election. And Ronald Reagan, one of his main admirers one of the people he admired the most was FDR. In his childhood, he was impressed by FDR's fireside chats, and that would shape his presidency. He was originally part of the Democratic Party, but changed his affiliation to the Republican Party after he saw communists trying to take over the Democratic Party. But overall, Ronald Reagan is a lot more liberal than both conservatives and liberals alike think that he is. A lot of people think that he's a staunch conservative, and while he did say that government was only there to create trouble, and he did participate in trickle-down economics, he did recognize the importance of welfare and helping Americans who needed help the most. So he upholded a lot of Social Security and Medicare programs, and this led to a wipeout election in 1984, where Walter Mondale was only able to win in his home state of Minnesota and as well as Washington, D.C., even though he had 40.6% of the vote. You can see here that even in his own state, he won by just a tilt margin, showing how popular Ronald Reagan was. This kept on going in 1988, and this is one of the first times where we see negative politics being used on a widespread scale. George H.W. Bush at the time was viewed as the underdog, but then he started to place negative ads on Michael Dukakis, and that helped him win the 1988 election. But Bill Clinton recognized the anti-candidate advertisements of the 1988 election, and he was able to deflect many of those in the 1992 election when George H.W. Bush was dealing with an economy that started to turn to the wrong direction, and Bill Clinton came and said that he would use taxes for investments, that he would not lower the taxes of wealthy Americans and do trickle-down economics, but instead he would use those taxes to invest in education and as well as other programs that could help Americans find jobs and find high-wage jobs. And he was re-elected in the 1996 election. Oh, and here we see the last time where a third-party candidate actually does well in an election, with Ross Perot, champion big business politics, champion libertarian policies, and he was able to win with 18.9% of the vote. And actually, just a fun fact, if Ross Perot used these votes in the right places, if he had these votes in California, in New York, and a few other states, and had 0 votes in other states, then he would technically have won the electoral vote on a plurality scale. He would have won with around 214 to 220 electoral votes, and but that shows how kind of screwed the electoral college is. We're not saying that the electoral college should be abolished, because there are reasons for having it, but that shows you the downsides of the electoral college, where you only really need 19 million votes out of how many votes is this? 45 plus 40, 85, about 105 million votes. You only need around 19 to 20 million votes in order to win an election. But that's besides the point. In the 1996 election, Bill Clinton won again. And then the 2000 election saw one of the most contentious elections ever, where George W. Bush was only able to win by around 500 votes in Florida. He won in Florida by, I don't want to say the margin, but he had 48.847% of the vote, compared to Al Gore, who had 48.838% of the vote. Let me check, because I have the 2000 election here on Jackson Jude. 48.84% of the vote. Bush won by 0.009% in Florida. And this was a very contentious election because Bill Clinton served for 2 years, and usually you don't see Democrats winning 3 terms in modern politics. And that held true in the 2000 election, when it was a lot about what was next for America, and Bush was able to win. And then Bush won again with he actually won the popular vote in the 2004 election. One of the only times where Republicans have won the popular vote since 1988. Ever since 1988, this was the only election where Republicans won the popular vote against John Kerry, who was not viewed so popularly. But George W. Bush was very popular at that time because of 9/11 and because he was a charismatic person. But we saw the not the Great Recession, we saw the 2008 financial crisis, and that hit a lot of Americans. And just like 1932, we saw Barack Obama win, not so nearly a landslide, but he won with 365 electoral votes in the 2008 election against John McCain. And Barack Obama brought in new politics. He brought in he brought in more of the modern politics that we see today. And you can see here that Barack Obama was able to win with less electoral votes, but still was able to win in 2012. But then in 2016, there was a political earthquake, and Donald Trump was able to win because both candidates were not really that good to the eyes of many Americans, but Hillary Clinton was viewed as a dishonest candidate. Meanwhile, Donald Trump was viewed as a candidate who could try to bring change in Washington. And in a lot of ways, he is similar to Ronald Reagan, which is that he appealed to the forgotten man of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Iowa, and he was able to win in all of those states, and thus he was able to win the election. And that turned out well until the pandemic started hitting, until COVID-19 hit America, and it was generally chaos under Donald Trump's administration by the end of his presidency. And by the end of his presidency, there were enough people in the in the independent and swing vote column in the Rust Belt states to flip their vote for Joe Biden, and he was able to win by 306 electoral votes. But you can see here that in these elections, they're very competitive. Ever since 2008, the elections have only gotten more and more competitive, and it's going to get even more competitive in future elections, electorally speaking. It used to be competitive in the popular vote, but nowadays we see Democrats win in the popular vote. But it's more competitive now in terms of the electoral votes, where we see a strong divide in pretty much every single thing you can think about in politics, between rural and urban, between business and government, between rich people and poor people, between southern states and northern states, eastern states, coastal states and middle states. Pretty much every single category you can think of, there's a divide between the Republican and Democratic parties. So it's going to be interesting to see how future presidential elections will go, but it will be unlike anything that we've seen prior to 2008, where back then it constantly flipped in landslides between Republicans and Democrats. Nowadays, we really can't expect any kind of landslide to happen. So that was all the elections. I know this was a very long video because there have been a lot of elections, but that's how American politics progressed from 1792, I believe. Let's go all the way there. From this, where is it? 1792 United States presidential election. I saw it right there. There we go. So all the way from 1972 to 2020. So that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.